you're going to turn to Genesis chapter 4. Now, for a few weeks of the year, I talk straight about stewardship and I talk about giving. So if you walked in Sacred this morning, I'm talking about money today. All right? And so a lot of people think, oh, the church always talks about money. You know what? Jesus talked about money more than anything else. He talked about money and possessions in more of his parables than he talked about any other topic. And it's a big deal in our lives. And it influences a lot of our decision-making process. It influences what careers we want to go into. My kids play the game of life on my iPad sometimes, because we don't actually have the board game, so they just play it on the iPad. And they make decisions based on how much money they want to make, right? They've already learned the pathways. Well, you can start making money right away if you don't go the college route, if you go like the trade route. But then they know that they can get better careers if they have the college route. They've learned this in the game of life. And we learn in life that money matters. We have to have it to kind of exist. We don't live in a trade culture anymore where we just barter for things and trade goods. And we don't live in an area where we're self-sustaining and we grow our own food and we have our own cow for milk and those kinds of things anymore. Most of the neighborhoods here on the peninsula, you're not going to see that. So we have to deal with money. So if we are believers, and we've said before here at Sacred, all of our life is our spiritual life, right? Our spiritual life is not just this one little compartment where we put like God in that little area, and so on Sundays I go to church, and I go to squad during the week, a small group, and that kind of stuff, like that's it. And that's my spiritual life. It's just this one component of my life. No, my entire life is my spiritual life. So that means everything about me, including my possessions, is spiritual. There's an element of that. And last week we talked about going from the mindset of the bag, if you remember this, to then the basket, and then to the barn. Okay? So if you missed that, you'll have to go to the website and watch that message from last week. And I told you that today we're going to walk through a passage that really explains why we need to move from the bag mindset of, well, I have what I have and I'm not going to be generous with my finances, my talents, my time, my relational credit, all of those things. I'm just going to hold it tight to me. To moving to a place where it's a basket, I'm willing to offer that, and I know God will have abundance, because then I can move to a barn mindset of storehouses so that I can supply needs for others. Okay? So there's the quick rewind of that. So this is the passage we're going to go through today that talks about this, and it might be interesting. Now, I do not normally come up with a title for my messages, by the way. We do series. By the way, the next series is going to be about heaven. It is going to be so good. Pastor Josh and I are really loving digging into this in our study time. You do not want to miss this next series on heaven. We're going to have a great Q&A night, too, where you can ask any question. You can submit them ahead of time so we can actually do some study work. And questions about heaven and hell and, when we die and those kinds of things. We're going to do a fun Q&A night. So here is this passage that talks about our giving life. Okay? So I don't normally title my messages. If I did today, though, it would be easy. It would be That Escalated Quickly. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. Now Adam had relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant. Then she gave birth to Cain. She said, with the Lord's help, I have produced a man. Do you know what I imagine in my mind when I do that? We all have different frames of reference for how we read the Bible, and we have to be aware of what things that we tend to insert in. But if you've ever watched the movie Castaway, there's that moment where Tom Hanks creates fire. He's like, fire! Oh, I have made fire. I'm kind of imagining Eve. I have created a man, right? Okay. Later, she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd while Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Now, I want you to underline, or if you're using electronic version of the Bible this morning, highlight it, but take a pen, underline, Cain presented some. Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Verse 4, Abel also brought a gift, the best of the firstborn. Underline, the best of the firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift. This made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. "Why are you so angry?" the Lord asked Cain. "Why do you look so dejected? You'll be accepted if you do what is right, but if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin's crouching at the door. It's eager to control you. You must subdue it and be its master." Verse 8, one day Cain suggested to his brother, "Let's go out into the fields." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Well, that escalated quickly. Afterward, the Lord asked Cain, "Where's your brother? Where's Abel?" "I don't know." Cain responded, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you're cursed and banished from the ground, which was swallowed your brother's blood. No longer will the ground yield good crops for you, no matter how hard you work. From now on, you'll be a homeless wanderer on the earth." Cain replied to the Lord, "My punishment's too great for me to bear. You've banished me from the land and from your presence. You've made me a homeless wanderer. Anyone who finds me will kill me." The Lord replied, "No, I'll give you a sevenfold punishment for I will give a sevenfold punishment to anyone who kills you." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain to warn anyone who might try to kill him. So Cain left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Hold on. Why in the world would he go and kill his brother? And why in the world wasn't his offering acceptable? See, I said that we need to go from a bag to a basket to a barn mindset. I have what I have. I don't have anything left to spare. I have to hold on to it. By the way, those bags always have holes in it, right? To a basket, I have an offering. I have something here. If somebody needs it, God can multiply it. To a barn, I have provision that I have stored up, and now I can save, and I can be a blessing to others and provide for their needs. And so what in the world does a homicide story have to do with the spiritual act of giving? When you go back to the beginning, in those two little sections that we underlined, Cain presented some. Abel brought the best of the firstborn. Cain presented some. Abel brought the best of the firstborn. As long as we're giving, why should it matter? Right? Now, I recommend that this is one of those days where you don't always answer all of my questions out loud. Okay? I mean, you can if you want. My dad used to say you can either say amen or oh my. Amen is when that's good. That's going to really reach somebody else. Oh my is, oh, I have to think about that a little more. What did it matter? Why didn't God see that Cain presented some of the harvest? He gave an offering to the Lord. Why did it suddenly escalate into, this is horrible, sibling rivalry just went bad, boom, murder, done, cursed, banished, gone forever? And might I mention, this is now a generational issue for them, for 2 generations of people, right? Adam and Eve were in the garden. Things were going well. Sin, big mistake, rebel against God, and what happened? Banished from the garden. They couldn't live in that perfect environment anymore. It broke their relationship with God and the ability to be in his presence. 2nd generation of mankind, we're already doing the exact same thing. Here's something we always need to realize when we're reading Scripture. Look for question marks when it comes to what God is saying. Think about this. God asks questions so that we can hear the answers. God asks questions so that we can hear the answers. Does God really need to know why? No, he already knows. Does God need to say, where's your brother? Was he unaware of what had happened? No. God knew exactly what had happened. He did the same thing with Adam and Eve. They were hiding after sin, and God's like, where are you? Hello. It's like playing hide and seek with a 3-year-old who's, like rear end is sticking up in the air as they try to hide in the corner. You know where they are. Where are you? You ask the question so they can have the moment of going, here I am. When God asks us questions, whether it's in the Word, in the Bible, or in our lives, it is not so He can learn the answer, it's so that we can. Cain, why are you dejected? Why are you so angry? What does your brother have to do with this moment? Let's talk about you and I, Cain. If you do what is right, you know that it'll go well for you. If you don't, then you're going to deal with the consequences. This actually was a new concept for mankind. We're only on generation 2. But we know that, don't we? If we do the right thing, there tend to be privileges. If we do the wrong thing, there tend to be consequences. So what was wrong? He gave. It was harvest time. He provided an offering. In order to figure out why there was an actual issue with his giving, let's go back to Genesis chapter 1. I'm going to start with verse 27. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. Then God said, look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your good. See, here's the deal. Who did it belong to in the first place? God. Who gave it to people? God did. Who said, here it is, I'm presenting it to you to rule over, human? God did. The difference between blessing and banishment is the concept of ownership. The difference between blessing and banishment is the concept of ownership. When we look at what the Bible teaches us about giving and about generosity, about the tithe, it actually matters what and how we give. And this passage teaches us why. Because it was time for the harvest, and Cain presented some. He, in other words, gathered everything he was going to do. He went through the entire harvest process. He knew all that he had, he was able to take stock of it. And when you look at all that you have, and suddenly you say, okay, this is the portion I'm putting over here, and this is the portion I'm putting over here, and this is the portion I'm going to put over here, and oh yeah, I do need to give a tithe. So all right, here's the 10%, and now I'm going to give that. Does that take any faith? Think about it. Does that take any faith? There's this concept of first fruits in the Bible. And it's one that it's not fun to preach about, okay? Because I'll be honest, you don't need to look around the room. Everybody has the same expression you do right now. So the entire room looks at the pastor like, right? You're kind of tucking your toes under so I don't step on them. All right? But here's the deal. I don't want people to live outside of God's presence. I don't want any part of your life to be placed outside of God's presence, because even though you think you're bringing it the right way, God can't honor it because of your heart. I want you to live in the blessing that God talks about and the blessing that he's provided for us. And the difference between that blessing and the banishment, not having that part of your life in the presence of God, is the question of ownership. Who had it first? God did. Every single thing I have, he had first. Every single paycheck, he had first. Every single food on my table, he had first. Every single beam on the roof over my head, he had first. Every single thing I wear, he had first. Every single child I have, he had first. Every single breath in my lungs, he had first. And when I get that, when I embody that, I suddenly realize I don't own any of it. I just steward it. I just steward it. And when I recognize that all I do with everything God has provided me, from my health to my finances to my family to my gifts and my talents and my relationships, all of those things, I just steward them. Because they were never mine to begin with. It all belongs to God. So why would I make the decision about where the first goes? See, when I'm managing things, when I'm stewarding things, there is an owner. If you think about it in terms of employment, when I'm managing and I'm stewarding someone else's finances, I'll be honest, the boss decides. And I need to respond to that. And we don't like to think of terms of God in terms of boss and finances, because it is much more fun to sing Good, Good Father. Okay? I get that. But when I'm saying, I'm going to deal with all of my finances, I'm going to deal with all of my time, I am going to arrange all of my resources, I am going to decide how all of my gifts and talents are used, I'm going to decide how all the relationships are going to run in my life, then I am saying that I am the sole decision maker and I am the one owning those things, where the difference between blessing and banishment is ownership. So when I say I'm going to decide at what point I give, and I'm going to decide what portion I'm going to give, and I'm going to decide when in the pay series that happens, then I am saying I own it. But I don't. What was the deal with Cain? He gave a portion, but God said, but you weren't following what you've been taught. Now, the difficult part with that is there isn't a whole lot of things going on before this in the Bible. This is Genesis chapter 4. So we don't know all of the other conversations that God has given them and how he's instructed them. But he does go on and through all the rest of this book talk about this concept of giving and talk about this concept of the tithe and the first fruits and all of these things. And so God is consistent. He's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And so when we look at that, it is very clear that the reason there was a problem with Cain's offering was because he just gave some. And we have it very clearly set against someone that it says gave the best of the first. He gave the best of the first. And God continues to set up this concept throughout the Old Testament, and Jesus actually talks about when you tithe, and it talks about generosity, and that that's just a starting place. We should be generous beyond that and all of that stuff. And Jesus keeps going forth to people, you need to give above and beyond that. And it is sacrificial giving and all of these concepts. And you look at it and you're like, okay, but I don't have livestock. So how does that work? Do I have to only give animals? Is that what God's saying? No, you give in faith, and there's a difference between giving in faith and just saying, well, I'm going to set some aside later. When a sheep had a lamb in the Old Testament, the first lamb was set aside. That first lamb was to be an offering to God. That was the tithe portion. Now here's the deal. When a sheep has given birth to one lamb, do you have any idea how many more lambs are on the way? Do you? No. That's faith. So now put it in a very modern context. I'm going to pay all my bills, and then when I know that I have enough to tithe, then I'll tithe. Does that require faith? There have been times in Ben and I's life where the math did not make sense. We would put everything on paper and, make a spreadsheet, and he'd be sitting with the computer and I'd be sitting with paper and pen, and we were just trying to do the math and make it work. And it didn't. There wasn't enough. And we were both raised up in church traditions, and we were both raised up to be generous givers and to tithe. And so there would be that moment where you'd look at each other and you're like, we can't. We can't. It's not there. But it required faith to give first. To say, God, I actually don't own any of this. You said return to you first, the tithe and the offering. So we give first, and at the end of the month, there was enough. There's these miracle stories that people tell about how, I just was in the service and there was a missionary or there was some plea or God just told me to give in the offering and he gave me this number. And so I didn't know how I was going to make the rent when I had to give that amount, if I was going to be obedient to God in the moment. But God told me $864, and so I just gave $864. And then the rest of the story is always these great miracle moments where then later somebody hands them a check and they say, God told me to give you $864. And there are these moments, and they are really cool stories to tell. We had best friends that lived near us in that moment, and we never told them what state our finances were in. We weren't making enough money at the moment to pay the bills and to keep the lights on and to have a phone so that we could call home or to put gas in the car or eat well that week. And we just decided, all right, we're going to tithe, we're going to give, and after that, it's going to be peanut butter and jelly's going to be a treat. And without saying anything to us or without us ever saying anything to them, our friends came to us and they said, we just feel like you're supposed to eat at our house all week. Now, we, on a routine basis, would trade back and forth, and wherever we were hanging out, we were two young married couples in their very early 20s, and so we'd often eat together, but then they came to us, and that's what they said. We just feel like you're supposed to eat at our house all week. So let's do it. Like every night, just come over after work. Was that them being awesome? Yeah. Was that God showing up because of faithfulness? Oh, yeah. I didn't eat peanut butter and jelly at all that week. I actually like peanut butter and jelly. I would have hated it by the end of the week. But there's just there wasn't going to be anything else there. And God said, here you go. I'm going to show up in that moment. Why was it bad? Because you will be accepted if you do what is right, but if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. I said the title would be That Escalated Quickly. That's what happens in our own lives. I'm going to be real honest. That's what happens in our lives. When we say to the concept of money and this all-consuming thing in our world and our government and how the earth turns on the almighty dollar, when we say to that we're the ones in control instead of God being in control, that is an incredibly slippery slope of sin.
How did it go so bad, so fast that these two brothers both brought an offering? One was pleasing to the Lord because it was what God had said for him to do. The other had just decided he was going to give whatever he wanted to give. And God said, come on, it is about your heart. It's not even about what kind of grain and all of those things anymore. It is about your heart, and it's not right. And because he could not hear from God, he couldn't be corrected in this area, he couldn't receive that from God, all of a sudden, now he can't even look at the person who's doing it the right way. Did his brother do anything to offend him? No. But now he's having trouble even being in the same home, in the same field, in the same place as somebody who was doing it right. And when you feel that you're in the wrong and you know that you're doing wrong because God's talking to you about it, it's called conviction. It's when we feel in our heart that just something isn't right about what we're doing. When we feel that way, it is harder to be around people of God who are doing the right thing. So then what do? We distance ourselves from the church. We distance ourselves from the body. And then all of a sudden, we just want to cut things off. Wow, that escalated quickly. But that's what happens. The difference between blessing and banishment is ownership. There's the old saying, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, it's interesting. Yes, you might possess it, but 9/10 of the law, what does that leave? A tenth. Robert Morris, a pastor in Texas, said, is it really an act of faith to give 10% after all your other bills are paid? I know this is harsh. But what's really harsh is not being in the presence of God. What's really harsh is living without the provision and the blessing on your life. This is not about how much goes in the offering plate. This is about your heart and your life and whether or not you're going to be stuck with the bag mindset or whether you're going to be able to move to the basket or whether you are going to be the kind of steward that has barns full of provision because God saw he could trust you with the little and you were faithful with his little, and so you're going to be faithful with his lots. That's the kind of life I want to have. And this passage teaches me it's all about recognizing it's his anyway. So I'm going to follow his directions with what he has given me. Over in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 11, it's the end of verse 16, and it's talking about mercy and how God isn't just the God of the Israelites, but that he has brought everyone into the family and that all people can receive the saving power of Christ. And so Paul is talking about this to the church in Rome. And in chapter 11, verse 16, it says, just as the entire batch of dough is holy because the portion giving as an offering is holy. For if the roots of the tree are holy, the branches will be too. Just as the entire batch of dough is holy because the portion given as an offering is holy. See, when we are obedient to God in our giving and our stewardship, in our finances, in our time, in our talents, in our relationships, when we steward that according to God's principle and say, first, I return to you what is yours. That actually creates a blessing over everything else I have. Now, do I want to pay the rest of the bills with blessed money or unblessed money? That's the real practical part that we all have to decide. I once had somebody ask me the question, Pastor, am I supposed to tithe off of the gross income or the net income? And I'm like, that is not in the Bible anywhere. Okay, those words are not in there. So the only answer I can give you is, do you want a gross blessing or a net blessing? And then my kids, like, you know, Jada's got the whole thing like, well, it's birthday gift. Do I like tithe off of a gift? All I can tell you is the Bible says off of all of your increase. Talk to Jesus about it. And we talk and we laugh about that, but then we sit down with our own bank account. And the paycheck comes in, and we say, okay, these are big, huge chunks. We have to pay them out. Do I want to pay the rest of my bills with unblessed money or with blessed money? Should it be that simple? Like, pay the tithe first or pay it at the end? Like, does it really matter? Well, do you set aside some, or is it the best of the first? And what happens when we do that is God begins to multiply. And God begins to stretch. And when we steward, God begins to bless. And there is this story, and I talked about it last week, of Jesus taking food out of the basket of the little boy, and he broke it, and he blessed it. And as he did that, it began to multiply, and at the end, they picked up these 12 huge baskets of leftover food. And when I am done paying my bills, I really need God to have broken and blessed it. And I would really love to pick up 12 baskets later. And I would love for him to say, not just at the end of my life, but at the end of every month, well done, good and faithful servant. See, I don't just want to say, oh, we're going to store up treasures in heaven. We're going to, make sure we give to missions and give the offering. I actually want a blessed life now. Not in that I need some big fancy house or car, and I need to have a certain status thing, and I need to shop in certain places or be seen at certain restaurants. That is not what a blessed life is about. The blessed life is having the barn so that when other people have need, it's there for them. The blessed life is saying, here's the basket, I'm going to give it to you, Jesus, so you can multiply it, and then there's not just going to be enough for my family right now, my little nuclear family unit, but there's also going to be enough for when the family comes back to restoration moments, like Joseph and his brothers show up during a famine, and they don't have anything to eat, and they sold him into slavery, and he can not just fix their hunger, he can fix the relationship in a broken family, because he's been a good steward, and he literally had barns of food. See, I want to be able to say to somebody who needs to have a conversation, come sit at my table. There's enough. I want to be able to say, I can take that meal. There's always enough, because God provided it anyway. I want to be able to say, God has blessed me, and so I can be a blessing. I want to desperately try to outgive God, because I know I can't. The more I give, the more he will bless. We talked about sowing and reaping, and we want to think about that in terms of physical, tangible things only when we sit down with our actual physical, tangible checkbook. But it relates to every single area of my life. Am I generous with my time? Am I generous with my talents? Am I generous with my relationships? Do I network other people or try to hold on to those relationships for when I need them? Oh, I can do that, but can I do that when I sit down with the offering, with the finances, with all of those things? But God, if I want you to bless the rest of this batch, then I set aside the first batch of dough. And I present it to you. You better believe I think that's some divine humor that he used the word dough and how we use it today. But here's the deal. Ben, you can go ahead and come on up. Romans chapter 5. Just flip back over a page from where you were. This is why we know this is actually a big deal still. Okay? That God really does care about this aspect of our spiritual lives still. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. Before you were a twinkle in your Father's eye, Christ died for you. God said, this is my only beloved son, firstborn, the best. And from the very beginning of time, Jesus was set aside. He was sent ahead of you and I to die on a cross as an offering for our sin, as a way for us to be removed from the shame and the guilt. Jesus was God the Father's tithe. And it provides for us. And because of that, everyone can be blessed. Everyone can receive truth, the gospel message, the life-saving power of Jesus' death and resurrection, of provision, of healing, of restoration, and relationships fixed, and marriages that are broken being healed, and finances that are broken being healed, and jobs that are lost and are broken being restored and granted, and promotions giving, and your life separated from the presence of God because of your own sin, because of our own decisions and our own choices. We live in banishment. But because of the offering of Jesus, we get to move from banishment to blessing. We get to come back into the presence of God. We get to be in right relationship. When God asked Cain those questions in Genesis 4, "Why are you so angry?" The Lord asked him, "Why do you look so dejected?" I think when we are in those moments where we recognize that we are angry, that we're dejected, we feel down about things, God asks us those questions so that we can hear the answer. And in those moments, it's important for us to recognize, where am I positioned when it comes to relationship with God? Have I just walked my own little self right out of that blessing? Have I just behaved my way right out of those provisions? And have I chosen things that bring consequence instead of things that bring privilege? This applies to every single area of our lives. But since God said first fruits come first, we have to talk about it at some point. We have to get honest with ourselves at some point that this really does matter to God. How do I want my life to be tomorrow? What do I want to walk in tomorrow? Then what decision am I going to make today? I want you to leave with this, and we're going to go into a time of worship and a time of communion and prayer this morning. I don't tithe out of responsibility. Okay? I tithe out of recognition that I have a Redeemer. I don't tithe because I was taught that I should. It's my job, it's my responsibility. I tithe out of recognition that I have a Redeemer who poured out his life for me. And when I recognize that, I want every area of my life redeemed. I want every area of my life redeemed, not just my eternity. I want now to be under the blessing and the provision and the hand of God. Will you stand with me this morning? In Luke chapter 22, Jesus is about to give his life as an offering. And he's sitting down at the table with his disciples. And he is doing something that probably reminded them of that moment in the field on the hill where he blessed and broke the bread, and he blessed and broke the fish, and it multiplied and it provided for thousands and thousands of people to eat that day, with baskets in abundance left over. And he's once again doing this thing where he takes it and he blesses it and he breaks it. And in Luke 22, verse 19, it says, he took some bread and he gave thanks to God for it. And he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Then after supper, he took another cup and he said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people. See, the relationship gets restored through it. An agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice. A sacrifice is a holy offering for you. In different settings here at Sacred, we do our communion practice a little differently. And there's nothing in the Bible that says it has to be a particular pattern or a particular routine. In fact, it says, as often as you do this, think of me. And so one of the reasons we do switch it up sometimes, whether we come to the table or whether it's passed out, that kind of thing, whether it's individual cups or whether we dip, and that's the division of it to the body. The reason we do that is so that it doesn't just become routine, but so that it kind of makes us think about what we're doing and actually do it in remembrance of Jesus. So as we worship today, I'm going to ask you to come. And we're going to do it by rows, and I'll just kind of come along as we begin to sing and Ben begins to lead us. And what I'm going to ask you to do this morning is to take from the bread and to take one of the cups. And this is where it might get uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you to find a place at the altar. And I'm going to ask you to have a conversation with God. Okay? Now you can do that out loud, and we promise we're not going to care. Or you can just do it quietly, but just do it heartfelt, okay? And I want you to have a conversation with God about what he has given you through the sacrifice of his body and his blood. And I want you to allow him to search your heart, to know you. He already does. And I want you to listen for the question. We're a people of the Spirit. We believe the Holy Spirit moves and speaks. I want you to listen for the question. This isn't going to be out loud to the whole group, individually to you. I want your heart to listen for the question. Why does God ask us questions? So we can hear the answer. And when you have that question and you know what God is asking of you, and you respond honestly, humbly, in that moment, I want you to take of the sacrifice, of the offering that he gave. Take of the bread and of the cup in remembrance that before you were even born, he gave for you. Jesus was set aside as an offering for you. That is a powerful thing to remember. It is an incredible blessing. God, today we ask for each person in this room to have that moment. Holy Spirit, I ask for you to speak supernaturally into each one of our hearts. And that we know when we are asked a question, it is so that we can humbly and honestly answer. What are you asking of us today, Father? What do we need to respond to or understand or step forward in our lives? What part of us, which belongs to you, are we holding back on? God, I don't want my life to be a slippery slope. I don't want things to escalate quickly in how I respond to my brother simply because I have a broken relationship with you. Remind us of your sacrifice, of your offering, and may we give ourselves to you. In Jesus' name. Will you worship with me this morning?